She was born in a small town where people didn't have much, but they had strong hearts and even stronger dreams. From the very beginning, her life was different. She could not see the world the way others did, while other children opened their eyes to colors, faces, and sunlight. She opened her ears to sound. Every sound, from the chirping of the birds in the morning to the soft voice of her mother humming lullabies, became her window to the world. Her parents worried at first. They wondered how a little blind girl would survive in a world that often judged too quickly. But they also noticed something special. Whenever music played on the radio, she would turn her head towards the sound, smiling, listening carefully, as if she could see pictures inside her heart. At only 3 years old, she could hum back entire songs after hearing them once. Her mother often said, "She may not see with her eyes, but she surely sees with her soul." The other children in the neighborhood played games like running, chasing, and skipping. She could not join them, but she never complained. Instead, she would sit near the old wooden piano that her uncle had once left in their house, pressing the keys gently, even though at first she did not know how to play. Each key made a different sound, and to her, it was like discovering new treasures every day. While others saw the piano as just an instrument, she treated it like her best friend. Her secret language to the world life was not easy. At school, some children were kind to her, helping her find her way, while others laughed, calling her names and making jokes about her blindness. Sometimes she cried quietly at night, asking her mother why she was different. Her mother would hold her close and say, "You are not less, my child. You are special. God has given you a gift, and one day the whole world will see it." Those words stayed in her heart. As she grew older, her connection with music became stronger. She could hear a melody once and play it back perfectly on the piano. Teachers were surprised, neighbors were shocked, and even strangers who visited her home could not believe what they heard. Some people said she had magic fingers, but she knew it was not magic. It was love. Music spoke to her in ways that words never could. While other children read storybooks with their eyes, she created stories through sound. She imagined rivers flowing with violins, skies painted with flutes, and storms roaring like drums. Every note she played was part of a world only she could see inside her mind. And every time she played, she felt free, as if blindness no longer existed. Her father, though poor, saved every bit of money he could to buy her music sheets in Braille, even if it meant working extra hours. Her mother encouraged her daily, reminding her that her talent was something rare. Slowly, people in the town began to notice. They invited her to play at small gatherings, churches, and school events. Each time she played, the crowd went silent, amazed at how a little blind girl could touch their hearts so deeply. But despite the praise, she still faced doubts. Some teachers told her parents not to expect too much, saying she will never be able to do what sighted children can. Those words hurt, but instead of breaking her spirit, they made her stronger. She promised herself that one day she would prove them wrong. Her favorite moments were at night, when the world became quiet. Sitting at the piano, she would let her fingers dance across the keys. Sometimes she played joyful tunes, other times soft melodies that sounded like whispers in the dark. For her, music was not just sound, it was comfort, strength, and hope. Although she had no eyesight, she had vision, a dream to play the piano before the world, to let her music reach places she could never walk to let her songs paint pictures for people who could see and for those who could not. Even as a little girl, she carried that dream close to her heart. In those early years, when life seemed hard and unfair, she found her greatest gift. She discovered that her blindness was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something greater. The little blind girl who had been pitied and mocked by some was already preparing for a destiny that would one day amaze everyone. She didn't know it yet, but the same piano keys she touched with childlike wonder would soon become the keys that opened the doors to the entire world. Asterisk, she grew up in a world where dreams often seemed too far away for a girl like her. People expected little from someone who could not see. They imagined her life would always be small, limited to her home, her family, and a quiet corner away from the brightness of the world. But deep inside her heart, she carried a dream bigger than anyone could imagine. Every day, after finishing her chores and schoolwork, she would sit at the piano. The piano was not only her friend, it was her escape, her voice, and her teacher. Whenever she touched the keys, she felt like the world opened wide for her, even though her eyes never had. She dreamed of one day playing on a grand stage, with people watching in silence, waiting to hear the very first note. She could almost imagine the sound echoing in the hall, the audience leaning forward, and then rising to their feet in thunderous applause. But dreams like hers were not easy. The little town she lived in had no big music schools, no fancy teachers, and no opportunities for a blind girl who wanted to play before the world. When she told people about her dream, many smiled politely but didn't believe her. Some even laughed. A blind girl on a big stage. They would whisper, "That's impossible." Still, she refused to let their doubts crush her. She believed that blindness did not define her. What defined her was the music flowing through her fingertips. She would tell herself, "I may not see the keys, but I can feel them, and I can hear the song in my heart. That is enough." Her mother always encouraged her. "Don't stop dreaming, my child," she would say softly. "The world may not believe in you now, but one day they will have no choice." Her father, though tired from long hours of work, would sit quietly and listen to her play in the evenings. Sometimes he would close his eyes and whisper, "One day your music will take you far away from here." As she grew older, she began to realize how hard the journey would be. At school, other children had access to books, pictures, and teachers who encouraged their talents. She had to learn in silence, relying on braille sheets or memory. Many times she felt left behind, but she pushed herself harder. While others needed sight to read music, she needed patience and imagination. She trained her ears to catch every single detail, the smallest shift in rhythm, the gentlest change in tone. She became so skilled that she could hear a piece of music once and replay it with perfection. She dreamed of applying to music competitions, but most required travel, money, and recognition that she didn't have. Each time she faced rejection, her heart ached, but her spirit grew stronger. She promised herself that one day she would stand on a stage so grand that no one could deny her gift. Evenings in her house became magical, while other families gathered. Around the television, her family gathered around her piano. Her brothers and sisters sat quietly, listening as she turned the little living room into a concert hall. The neighbors would often stop outside the window, curious, whispering, "How does she do it?" Slowly, word spread in the community that the blind girl was no ordinary child. She was a prodigy, but with every compliment, there was also criticism. Some adults said it was dangerous to fill her head with such big dreams. She will only get hurt, they warned her parents. She should focus on learning simple skills to survive. Music will not take her anywhere. But her parents refused to clip her wings. They knew that music was not just a hobby for her. It was her destiny. She began to imagine her future more vividly. She saw herself in long gowns, walking slowly onto a stage, guided not by her eyes, but by her heart. She imagined herself sitting at a grand piano, bigger and shinier than the old one in her house, her fingers ready to create magic. And she imagined the crowd, people from all walks of life, who would come together not to pity her, but to admire her gift. Of course, the journey was lonely. Sometimes, late at night, she would cry quietly on her pillow. The thought of being blind forever frightened her. She wished she could see the colors she played about, the faces of her parents, the hands that clapped for her. But then she would remind herself that perhaps she didn't need eyes to see. She could see through sound, through feeling, and through faith. That thought gave her courage. Day by day, her dream grew clearer, like a painting forming in her imagination. She didn't know how it would happen, or when, or where, but she believed it would. Her blindness was a barrier in the eyes of others, but in her own heart. It was a test she was determined to pass. What she did not know then was that her chance would come sooner than she expected. And when it did, her dream would not only change her life, but also touch the hearts of millions. The day that would change her life forever began like any other. The town was buzzing with excitement because a grand music festival was being held at the local auditorium, something rare in such a small place. Posters had been put up weeks before, announcing that a world-famous pianist would be the guest of honor. His name was known everywhere. He had traveled across countries, performed in the grandest halls, and earned standing ovations from kings and queens. For most people in the town, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to see him play. The blind girl, now a teenager, heard about the festival from her school music teacher. Her heart skipped a beat. To her, this was more than an event. It was an opportunity to feel connected to the wider world of music. Even though she knew she was just a nobody in the eyes of such a celebrated artist, deep inside, she dreamed of somehow showing him what she could do. She wanted to prove that music wasn't about fame or sight. It was about the soul. On the evening of the festival, the auditorium glowed with bright lights. Families dressed in their best clothes arrived, whispering excitedly as they found their seats. The blind girl came with her parents, her hand resting gently on her mother's arm for guidance. She could not see the grandeur of the hall, but she could hear it, the echo of voices, the clinking of instruments being tuned, the soft shuffle of feet. Every sound painted a picture in her mind. The famous pianist arrived on stage, tall and confident, wearing a perfectly pressed suit. The crowd erupted into applause even before he touched the keys. He gave a charming smile, bowed dramatically, and began to play. His fingers flew across the piano with speed and elegance, filling the hall with a grand melody. The audience was enchanted, whispering to each other about his brilliance. The blind girl sat still, listening carefully. The man was indeed talented, but she also noticed something the others did not. Behind the speed and showiness of his performance, there was pride, a kind of arrogance in the way he played, as though he wanted to impress rather than to connect. She admired his skill, yet she felt a distance from his music. For her music was supposed to speak to the heart, not just to the ears. After his performance, the host of the event announced that young talents from the community would also get a chance to perform. The girl's heart began to race. Her teacher had secretly submitted her name, believing in her gift. When her name was called, the auditorium fell into a curious silence. People whispered, surprised that a blind girl had signed up to play in front of a master pianist. Guided by her mother, she slowly walked onto the stage. The bright lights warmed her skin, and she could sense hundreds of eyes staring at her. Some felt pity, others doubt, and a few looked intrigued. The famous pianist, sitting at the side of the stage, raised an eyebrow when he saw her. "Are you serious?" he said loudly enough for the front rows to hear. A ripple of laughter passed through part of the audience. He leaned forward with a smirk and added, "You think you can play? Do you even know where the keys are?" His words cut through the air like a knife. The girl's chest tightened, but she stood still, her face calm. The host tried to brush off the pianist's remark with an awkward laugh, but the damage was done. Many in the audience chuckled uncomfortably. The girl could feel their doubt pressing against her like a heavy weight. For a moment, she thought of walking away. But then, She remembered her mother's words. One day, the world will have no choice but to believe in you. Taking a deep breath, she gently found her way to the piano bench. The laughter faded into murmurs as the audience watched her. The pianist crossed his arms, clearly expecting her to fail. The stage grew quiet, so quiet that even the sound of her hand brushing the keys could be heard. She placed her fingers carefully, her touch soft but sure. Inside her heart, she whispered, "This is my dream, and I will not let anyone take it from me." The famous pianist leaned back in his chair, amused. He had no idea what was about to happen. The silence inside the hall felt heavy, almost painful. All eyes were on the young blind girl sitting nervously. At the grand piano, the stage lights glowed on her face, revealing not fear but quiet determination. Yet before she could even touch a single key, the famous pianist's mocking voice cut through the air once again. "Well," he said loudly. With a smirk, "This should be interesting." His tone dripped with sarcasm, and a few people in the audience laughed softly. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, as if settling in for a comedy show rather than a musical performance. "Do you even know which end of the piano makes the high notes, little girl?" he added cruelly. The girl's hands froze on her lap. She could not see his face, but she could feel the weight of his arrogance. The room filled with uneasy murmurs. Some people chuckled nervously, embarrassed by his words, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or to stay quiet. It was as if the entire auditorium had become a stage not for music, but for ridicule. The host tried to intervene. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile, "let's give this young lady a chance. Every performer deserves respect." But his voice trembled, and the power of his words was lost. The famous pianist waved his hand dismissively and whispered something to the person sitting next to him. They both laughed. From her seat, the girl's mother clenched her hands tightly together. Her father leaned forward, his jaw tense, but neither of them moved. They knew their daughter had to fight this battle on her own. The blind girl sat still, her fingers brushing gently against the piano keys, not yet pressing them down. She could hear the whispers, the laughter, the doubt floating in the air like sharp needles. For a moment, her heart ached, and she wondered if everyone saw her as a joke. She thought about leaving the stage, about running back into the comfort of her parents' arms. But then she remembered all the nights she had cried, all the days she had been told she could never achieve her dream. If she gave up now, she would prove the pianist right. The famous pianist chuckled again and called out, "Go on then. Play something simple. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That might be more your level." Laughter echoed through parts of the crowd, cruel and sharp. The girl took a deep breath. Her face remained calm, but inside her heart she was battling a storm. She thought of her mother's words, "You are not less. You are special. God has given you a gift." She thought of her father sitting late into the night, listening proudly as she played, and she thought of her own promise that one day the world would know her music. Slowly, she straightened her back. Her small hands rested firmly on the piano keys. The hall grew quieter, though a few people still snickered. She whispered to herself so softly that only she could hear, "I will not let their laughter drown my song." The pianist shook his head, still smirking. To him, she was only wasting time. But in that moment, something powerful was about to unfold. The girl pressed down the first key. A single pure note floated into the hall, cutting through the whispers like light breaking. The darkness, the sound was so clear, so sharp, that even those who had been laughing stopped suddenly. As if the note had commanded silence. She paused, letting the single note linger in the air before adding another, and then another. Soon, the beginnings of a melody flowed from her hands. At first, it was gentle, like a whisper, but then it grew stronger, more confident. The audience leaned forward, realizing that what they were hearing was not the clumsy playing they had expected, but something extraordinary. The famous pianist's smile slowly faded. He uncrossed his arms, leaning closer, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Each note that poured from the girl's fingers carried not just sound, but emotion, sadness, strength, and beauty woven together in perfect harmony. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, the hall was utterly silent. The laughter, the whispers, the arrogance, all had vanished. There was only the girl, the piano, and the music that seemed to flow directly from her soul. What had started as public mockery was transforming before their very eyes into a moment of awe. The audience that had doubted her now sat stunned, many holding their breath, as if afraid that even the slightest sound would disturb the magic unfolding on stage. The girl, however, played on with her eyes closed, her heart open. She was no longer thinking about the pianist's cruel words or the audience's laughter. She was lost in her own world, in the music that had been her companion since childhood. The keys beneath her fingers were not obstacles, but wings, lifting her higher with every note, and though she could not see it, the very man who had mocked her was now leaning forward, his face pale with shock. For the first time in years, he was speechless. The girl's fingers rested on the keys as the echoes of her first notes hung in the air. The silence that followed was heavy, but no longer mocking. 'Twas the silence of people realizing that they had underestimated someone. The silence of shame, creeping in after laughter. Yet she did not notice their shifting emotions. She wasn't playing for them. Not really. She was playing for herself, for her parents, for the dream she had carried for so long. Her courage wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of bravery that shouted back at insults or threw anger in the face of mockery. Her courage was quiet, like a candle glowing in a dark room. It didn't demand attention, but it refused to be extinguished. She didn't argue with the pianist. She didn't defend herself with words. She simply let the music become her answer. Inside her, a storm had been brewing since she had heard his cruel laughter. Every hurtful memory from childhood, every whisper of "you can't," every doubt that had been thrown at her seemed to rise again in her heart. But instead of breaking her, it fueled her. The pain turned into power and the fear into determination. She reminded herself, if I quit now, their words win. If I play, my heart wins. And so, with her head lifted slightly, she pressed her fingers firmly onto the keys once more. This time, the music swelled with strength. It was no longer gentle or hesitant, it was bold. Each note rang out as though it were shouting, "I am here. I am strong. I will not be silenced." The audience leaned forward. The same people who had chuckled moments ago now sat frozen, their eyes wide, their breaths caught. Even the children in the back row, who had been fidgeting earlier, were now still, mesmerized by the transformation happening on stage. Her parents watched with tears building in their eyes. Her mother clutched her father's hand tightly. They had always known their daughter was special. But even they were overwhelmed by the strength radiating from her performance. It wasn't just music. It was a declaration. She was showing the world who she really was, not a blind girl to be pitied, not a weak child to be mocked, but a young woman with a gift that could silence even the cruelest voices. The famous pianist, sitting on the side of the stage, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His mocking smile had completely vanished. His eyes followed her hands as they danced across the keys with precision and grace. He had thought she would stumble, fumble, or give up under the weight of ridicule. But instead, she had risen higher, fueled by a courage he himself no longer possessed. What struck him most wasn't just her technical skill, though it was remarkable. It was the depth of her music. Every phrase she played carried emotion he couldn't replicate. While he had trained in the finest schools and practiced under the strictest masters, she played with something none of them could teach, the voice of a soul that had suffered, endured, and still chosen beauty over bitterness. Her courage was also in the way she carried herself. She didn't flinch when people laughed. She didn't tremble when the hall seemed against her. She simply sat straight, her face calm, her hands steady. It was as if she had built a world within herself, a safe place where no insult could reach. She invited the audience into that world through her music. The song she played grew richer, rising and falling like waves. At times it was soft, like a whisper of forgiveness, and at times powerful, like a roar of defiance. The audience began to feel something stir inside them: guilt, admiration, respect. Many of them thought back to how quickly they had judged her when she first walked on stage. Now they felt ashamed of their thoughts. As the girl played, she remembered her childhood. She remembered sitting alone at the piano while the other children ran outside, the sting of their laughter when they called her names. She remembered the dark nights when she cried into her pillow, wishing she could see. And she remembered the gentle encouragement of her parents, the belief they had planted in her when no one else believed. All of those memories poured out into her performance, filling each note with a story. Minutes passed, though to the audience it felt like seconds. They were lost in her music, captivated by her silent strength. Not once did she raise her voice. Not once did she argue with the pianist. Her response was in every key she touched, every chord that vibrated through the hall. She was proving that true courage doesn't always shout sometimes. It simply shines until no one can deny it. When she reached the final part of her piece, the hall was so quiet that even the sound of her fingers lifting from the keys could be heard. She played the last note slowly, tenderly, as if sealing her story with grace. Then she let her hands rest gently in her lap. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning. It was not filled with doubt or laughter. It was filled with awe. The audience didn't even clap at first. They were too stunned, too moved to react. They simply stared at her, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. And in that silence, she sat with calm dignity. She did not bow her head in shame, nor did she raise it in arrogance. She simply sat quietly, her face serene, as if saying without words, "I told you so. I am enough." Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment longer, as though she was drawing strength from the silence. Then, with a calm breath, she began. The first notes were soft, delicate, like morning light creeping over a quiet landscape. They were not hurried, not showy, just honest and pure. Each sound floated into the hall like a whisper of hope. The audience leaned in. It was not what they expected. Many had imagined clumsy notes, an awkward attempt, something to prove the famous pianist's mockery right. But instead, what came was something so breathtakingly gentle that people found themselves holding their breath, afraid to miss a single sound. Her fingers moved with certainty. Though her eyes could not see the keys, her touch was so sure that it felt as if the piano belonged to her. She played not with sight, but with memory, feeling, and instinct. Each note carried the weight of her journey, the nights of loneliness, the tears no one saw, the dreams she had held on to despite every doubt thrown her way. Slowly, the music began to swell. It was no longer a whisper, but a voice, strong, unshakable, undeniable. The melody rose higher, filling every corner of the auditorium. The walls seemed to vibrate with the richness of the sound, and the people listening felt it sink into their very bones. Children who had been restless earlier now sat wide-eyed, entranced. Old men who thought they had heard every kind of music felt their eyes sting with unexpected tears. Mothers held their children close. Fathers nodded quietly, moved in ways they couldn't explain. The blind girl's music was not just a performance. It was a message. It said, "Do not pity me. Do not laugh at me. I am more than what you see." The famous pianist, who had been leaning back smugly at the start, now sat upright. His face was no longer mocking, but unsettled. He had played on the finest pianos, studied under the greatest masters, and performed for kings and queens. Yet, here was a girl with no formal training, no sight, no privilege, and her music had more soul than anything he had produced in years. He shifted in his seat, his pride struggling against the truth he was witnessing. As the girl continued, the music grew bolder. It became a storm, fierce, commanding, unstoppable. Her fingers raced across the keys, each chord struck with precision and fire. The hall vibrated with energy, and the audience felt as if they were caught in a wave too powerful to resist. The same people who had laughed minutes before now sat in stunned silence, their faces glowing with awe. And yet, within the storm of her music, there were moments of softness. She slowed down, letting the melody sink low, tender and fragile, like a quiet prayer. These moments pierced the heart even deeper than the grand, thunderous chords. They reminded the listeners of sadness, of longing, of love lost and found. It was as though she was telling a story with no words, a story everyone could understand because it was built from feelings they all carried inside. Her courage shone in every movement. She did not rush to prove herself. She did not try to copy the pianist's style of speed and flourish. Instead, she let her music flow naturally, as if it was alive, as if it was speaking through her. She had no need to compete with him. She wasn't playing to be better than anyone. She was playing to be true to herself. Minutes passed, though no one in the audience noticed. Time seemed to disappear. All that existed was her and the piano, her music filling the space like sunlight after rain. The famous pianist, humbled and astonished, now leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. He no longer smirked, no longer laughed. Instead, he looked like a man realizing that talent without humility meant nothing, and that this blind girl, whom he had mocked, had something he had lost long ago: authenticity. The climax of her performance arrived. Her hands moved with breathtaking speed, the notes pouring out like a river breaking free from its dam. The hall shook with the power of her playing, and people felt their hearts race as though they were part of the music itself. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others had tears streaming down their cheeks. Everyone knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. And then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the music softened again. The storm calmed. The girl let the melody fall back into a gentle whisper, a closing chapter of the story she had told. The final notes lingered in the air, like stars in the night sky, glowing long after her fingers had left the keys. She sat still, her hands resting on her lap. Her head remained slightly lifted, her face serene, as though she was listening to the echo of her own music fading into silence. She didn't smile or frown. She simply sat quietly, her presence as dignified as her performance. The hall was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, but a silence of awe. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, captured by the memory of her music. And then it happened. The sound of hands clapping, slow at first, then louder, faster, stronger, until the entire hall thundered with applause. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others looked at one another in disbelief. The same audience that had doubted her now celebrated her as if she were a queen. The famous pianist did not clap right away. He sat frozen, his face pale, his pride shattered. But as the ovation grew, he slowly rose to his feet, bowed his head, and joined in. It was the only thing left for him to do, to admit, silently, that the girl he had mocked had surpassed him in the most important way. Asterisk. For a long, breathless moment after the last note faded, the hall remained utterly silent. The sound of her music still lingered in the air, echoing in the hearts of everyone present. It was as if the world itself had stopped, unwilling to break the spell she had cast. The blind girl sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. She did not crave applause, nor did she wait for validation. Her music had been her truth, and she had spoken it with every note. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was soft but steady, breaking the silence like a gentle wave. Slowly, others joined in, one by one at first, then in dozens, and finally in hundreds, until the hall thundered with applause. People rose from their seats, clapping furiously, some cheering, others shouting words like "bravo" and "amazing." The blind girl could not see the standing ovation before her, but she could feel it. The vibrations of their hands striking together, the roar of voices rising, the floor beneath her trembling from the sheer force of the crowd, all of it told her what her eyes could not. A soft smile spread across her face, small but radiant, for she knew in that moment that she had been heard, truly heard. The audience's reaction was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Mothers wiped tears from their cheeks, clutching their children as if to say, "Remember this. Remember what strength looks like." Fathers stood tall, some with their arms crossed tightly, hiding the emotion in their eyes, but unable to stop clapping. Young children stared in wide-eyed wonder, too innocent to understand the weight of what had just happened, but old enough to know they had witnessed something extraordinary. Some people buried their faces in their hands, shamed of the laughter they had shared earlier. They had doubted her, mocked her silently in their hearts, and now they felt humbled, even guilty. They realized they had not just underestimated a blind girl, they had underestimated the human spirit. At the front of the hall, the famous pianist remained seated, his applause slower, his face drained of color. His earlier smirk had long vanished, replaced by an expression of disbelief. He had thought himself untouchable, the master of the piano, the star of the evening. Yet here he was, overshadowed by a girl whom he had mocked and ridiculed. Her music had reached a depth he could not. It had stripped away his arrogance and left him exposed. The audience noticed his discomfort. Some glanced at him, their eyes sharp, as if silently rebuking him for his cruelty. Others ignored him altogether, giving their attention fully to the girl who had earned it. The pianist tried to mask his feelings with a stiff smile, but it was too late. The respect of the crowd had shifted, and it no longer belonged to him. Meanwhile, the blind girl sat quietly on the bench, still unaware of the man's pale face and shattered pride. She only heard the love pouring from the crowd, and it was enough. She bowed her head slightly, her way of saying thank you, and the applause grew louder still. People began stamping their feet, filling the hall with a rhythm that shook the very walls. Her parents, standing in the front row, wept openly. Her mother covered her mouth, sobbing softly, while her father clapped with all his strength, his eyes glistening. For years, they had carried the weight of other people's pity, the sting of cruel words, the fear of their daughter being dismissed by the world. And now, here she was, not dismissed, but celebrated, not pitied, but admired. Their pride knew no bounds. The host of the event, who earlier had stumbled nervously through the pianist's insults, now rushed onto the stage, his voice booming with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted over the roar of the crowd, "let us give another round of applause for this incredible young talent." His words only fueled the ovation further. People began chanting, calling her a prodigy, a genius, a gift to the world. Some shouted that she deserved to tour across the country, that her music should be heard everywhere. The girl sat still, her cheeks warm with emotion. She had never imagined such a response. She had only wanted to play, to share her music, to prove to herself that she could stand on a stage. But what she had done was far greater. She had touched hearts, changed minds, and left a mark on everyone present, even the pianist. Overwhelmed by the tide of admiration directed at her, could not remain seated any longer. Slowly, reluctantly, he rose to his feet. He clapped, though his applause lacked the fire of the others. His pride was wounded, his reputation shaken, but he knew that not standing would expose him further. So he stood, bowing his head slightly, as though conceding defeat. The audience noticed, and some smirked knowingly. They understood the irony. The man who had mocked her now had no choice but to honor her. It was poetic justice, and it only deepened their respect for the girl. When at last the applause began to soften, the girl rose carefully from the piano bench. She felt for her mother's guiding hand as she stepped forward. The crowd erupted once more, many reaching out their hands as if hoping to touch her, to share in her light. Though she could not see them, she felt their presence, their warmth, their admiration. As she left the stage, the people continued clapping, some calling out her name, others wiping away the last of their tears. The hall buzzed with energy, with conversations about what they had just witnessed. Strangers turned to each other, saying things like, "I will never forget this night." The famous pianist, still standing, stared after her as she walked away. In his heart, he knew he had been humbled, not by another professional, not by a rival, but by a girl he had once dismissed as nothing. And in that humbling, he felt the sharp sting of shame, but also the faint stirrings of respect. He had underestimated her, and now the entire world seemed to rise in her defense. The blind girl, unaware of his inner turmoil, walked off stage with her parents. She did not need his approval. She had already won something far greater: the love of the crowd, the pride of her family, and the satisfaction of knowing that she had stayed true to herself. That night, the applause of strangers became the proof she had long awaited, that her blindness was not her weakness, but her strength. And the memory of the ovation would stay with her forever, echoing louder than any insult ever could. Asterisk, that night at the auditorium was only the beginning. The standing ovation, the tears, the humbled silence of the famous pianist, all of it stayed in the hearts of those who witnessed it. People walked out of the hall not just entertained, but changed. It was as though the blind girl had not only played the piano, but had touched something hidden inside each of them. They carried her music home with them, speaking about it to their families, their neighbors, their friends. By morning, the story had already begun to spread. In the small town where she lived, her name became a source of pride. No longer was she the poor blind girl whispered about with pity. Now, she was the girl who had stunned a world-class pianist. The girl whose music could make even the proudest man bow his head. Children began to look up to her, practicing their own instruments with new excitement. Parents reminded their children of her story whenever they wanted to give up. She had become living proof that greatness was not limited by what the eyes could see. Soon, word traveled beyond her town. Someone had recorded part of her performance that night, and the shaky video found its way onto the internet. Within days, it spread like wildfire. People from different countries, different languages, and different walks of life shared it, writing comments filled with awe. "I cried watching this. This girl is a gift to humanity. She plays with her soul, not her hands." News reporters came searching for her. Articles were written, interviews requested. The story of the blind girl who had been mocked and then amazed the world became a headline in magazines and on television. But through it all, she remained humble. When asked how she felt about her sudden fame, she would smile softly and say, "I only wanted to share my music. If it inspires others, then that is my greatest reward." The famous pianist himself, once filled with arrogance, was forced to confront his pride. At first, he avoided the subject, embarrassed by the memory of his mockery. But eventually, An interview, he admitted, "That girl taught me more in one evening than I learned in all my years of training. She reminded me of what music truly is. Not performance, but heart." His words surprised many, but they also showed how deeply he had been affected by her. For the blind girl, opportunities began to open. Invitations came from larger stages, bigger cities, even international festivals. Yet, no matter where she played, she carried with her the same humility she had shown on that first night. She did not play to impress or to prove anyone wrong anymore. She played to connect, to heal, to lift others. And wherever she went, the audience felt it. Her story reached not only musicians, but people in all walks of life. Students struggling with exams, workers tired of endless challenges, mothers and fathers carrying heavy burdens, all found strength in her example. They would think, if she can rise above blindness and cruelty, then I can rise above my own struggles. In hospitals, her video was played for patients battling illness. In schools, teachers told her story to inspire children to never give up. Even in prisons, her music was shared as a reminder that hope can bloom in the darkest places. She became more than a pianist. She became a symbol. To the blind, she was proof that disability is not the end of dreams. To the poor, she was proof that greatness is not reserved for the wealthy. To the broken, she was proof that pain can be turned into beauty. And to the arrogant, she was a warning. Never underestimate the power of those you look down upon. Years later, when people looked back at her journey, they did not only remember the music, they remembered the courage. The courage to walk onto a stage where she was mocked. The courage to sit quietly while the world laughed. And the courage to let her music speak louder than insults ever could. What began as a moment of humiliation had transformed into a legacy of inspiration. The girl who once cried silently in her room, wondering why she was different, had become the woman who made millions believe in themselves again. She had turned her pain into purpose, her struggle into strength, and her blindness into a light for the world. And though she could not see the faces of those she inspired, she felt them in the cheers, in the applause, in the countless letters and messages sent her way. She did not need eyes to know that her story had reached farther than she ever dreamed. Some say that true greatness is not measured by fame, money, or recognition. It is measured by how deeply one touches the lives of others. By that measure, the blind girl's greatness was immeasurable. Her legacy lived not only in the music she played, but in the hearts she healed, the dreams she awakened, and the voices she encouraged to rise. The night she played against mockery, she didn't just win applause. She won something eternal. A place in history as the girl who reminded the world that courage, love, and truth will always be stronger than cruelty, doubt, and arrogance. And so, her story continues to live on. Not just as a tale of a blind girl who amazed the world, but as a reminder to every soul who hears it. Never let anyone tell you what you cannot do. Believe in yourself, hold on to your gift, and one day, your light will shine so brightly that the world will have no choice but to stand in awe.